Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be looking at some of my games in the first international match between England and Finland, played on Lichess earlier today. And in this format, all the games are 3 minutes plus 2 seconds increment, and it's played like an arena tournament with the ability to berserk, where you then just have 1 minute and 30 seconds flat with no increment. The way it works is that all the players who are playing for, say, the English team will only be playing against players in the Finnish team and vice versa. And the way they calculate who has won the match is that the top, I believe it's the top 20 scorers for England have all their scores added together, and that's compared with the Finland team's top 20 players' scores added together, and then you then can see who's won it. And I believe in this match there were over 60 people playing, so some of them didn't have their scores counted because they got too few. My aim for this was to actually score the most out of any player on both sides, so I will reveal if I did that at the end. I'm not going to go through every game because as it was 3+2 and the tournament was about an hour and a half, I played dozens of matches. I'm only going to go over about 5 or so. So I believe this was the first game or second game of the event. I'm playing a 1760, so I would be expected to win. And I've played a Tennyson Gambit. This is like the Budapest, but in reverse, with the difference being that black has not played pawn c5, which would be a true Budapest Gambit reversed. And with the lack of the c-pawn moving, that does alter the position quite a big deal. I actually think black is better than white is in the Budapest. The side who is the pawn up, which is black, I think is close to winning in this line. But I played it anyway because I pre-moved knight to f3 on move 2, which was a bit of a silly decision. Knight f6, knight c3, bishop f5 to defend the pawn. And here I chose to play bishop c4. Normally in this line, if the colours were reversed, you would put your bishop to check the opponent. But here, black can move their c-pawn one step to block the check and attack my bishop, which would not be possible in the mainline Budapest. So you can already see I'm having to alter my moves. Black sees I'm attacking f7, and I then play queen e2 to attack the pawn. And here black has the option to play bishop to g4. I don't think I have much better than what I played, which was f3, giving away the pawn for real, and having a nasty pin on myself. The only slight compensation I have is that I've developed more pieces for the moment. And black doesn't really take advantage of their pawn, and they play a rather passive c6, which gives me time to repair the damage and quickly get my pieces out. So I've kept up my initiative, tried to get good, well-positioned pieces that are attacking some of black's own pieces, and they solidify with knight d7, so I go queenside in this position. Normally I would play kingside castles, because my rook would be on f1 on the open file, but here I thought that I may want to do a pawn storm with chucking up my h and g pawns if black chooses to castle on the kingside. They play h6, so I drop back, keeping pressure on their knight. Queen a5, and I don't want any problems with my a2 pawn becoming vulnerable. I put my king on b1, which may be a bit of a waste of a move. Possibly rook hf1 was the stronger option. Castles, h3 to attack the bishop. They do take me, and now queen takes would be more normal because it would, keep my pawn structure intact. Taking with the piece is usually the right idea, but after knight to e5, what's going to happen is that Actually, in that position, it was much better. But even if black doesn't play the best move and simply takes my bishop, I've traded off 2 minor pieces and I'm still a pawn down. This doesn't really fill me with confidence. There was also other options black could have done instead of knight takes bishop, but to keep things simple, that's what could happen. Anyway, I took with the g-pawn to keep on the bishop pair for myself. That's one small advantage I may have. Knight to e4, so if they trade, I'll take back with my f-pawn and repair my pawn structure, keeping 2 central pawns. So, as you can see, I might have been Steinitz, but I may be wrong. It was one of the old sort of chess legends who said that it's a game of, accumulating small advantages. And that's what I've been trying to do. I've gained the bishop pair. I'm hoping to, force black to release tension and improve my pawn structure. And I'm also opening up certain lines towards their king. For example, the g file is now open. So I've been playing with a plan. Now I play rook hg1 to continue my initiative. Then queen g2, threatening the mate, but they see it. And here I go bishop e1. My plan was to put the bishop on either d2 or c3, where it would line up with black's king even more than it was on h4. Black drops back, and they're really playing passively in this line. That's not really what you want to do when you're material up. You want to try either trading pieces or maximizing your advantage by trying to gain the initiative yourself. Black shoves their pawns up in their own pawn storm. Not a bad plan. Here I start to go downhill because, as you may see, I've got 42 seconds and they still have over 2 minutes, as they have not berserked this game, and I have. I lose a pawn. Now black's the one who's got the initiative, but I still had hopes. I play queen d2, both as a defensive move, but also I do have some tactical tricks coming up. Bishop b4 was played, and I don't want to dislodge my queen or trade any minor pieces, so I play c3. Bishop back to e7, again maintaining this passive approach, which is working out well for them right now. And I play king c2, which is essentially a defensive move. And also it may lull my opponent into a false sense of security. My next plan was to improve the d rook by putting it on g1, with my other rook moving up a few squares. Black played a4, and I dropped my bishop back, keeping it lining up with the black rook on g8 and the pawns. a3, black's continuing the approach, and at this point I'm down to less than 30 seconds. Black's got a very clear advantage, and I choose this moment to play as tactically as possible, sacrificing my bishop and then playing rook g6, where the threat is, if black does a nonsense move like pawn a2, I can play rook takes h6, trying to gain the advantage by checkmate. And if black plays pawn takes rook, queen takes is actually checkmate, because the knight on f6 is pinned from my bishop, so it cannot interpose to save the king. And that was my chance. Black instead chose an even worse move, knight takes e4, and then I had checkmate on h6. Of course, this sort of sacrifice doesn't usually end up working, because if black played it well, they would win. It's already -8. Black has a huge advantage. My tactic did not work at all, but being down to just a few dozen seconds will often force you to play this kind of hope chess in a way. No disrespect to my opponent, it's not that easy to work out, even with a minute or two on your clock, so it's perfectly understandable they make a mistake under this immense pressure. But that was a win under my belt. Next game I played someone of the same rating, of just over 1750. This time I'm black. So this game's a d4 opening, with me responding in kind. And I choose to move my light square bishop out very early. I tend to do this in blitz a lot, because when you play normally in like rapid or standard play, the bishop on c8 often doesn't move that early, because white can often play queen b3 and attack my b7 pawn. I take advantage of the fact their c pawn hasn't moved yet, though, so their queen can't go to b3 and undermine my queenside. f3, bishop h5, knight h3, an unorthodox developing plan, the idea being knight f4 and getting the bishop pair. I don't want that to happen, so I get the trade of bishops. My h-rook is now more active, and after knight f4 I play e6, getting a very solid light square grip on the position. Castles from my opponent on the king side. So at this point I was thinking about attacking the king. In most games in blitz I don't usually play like really slow positional maneuvering and attacking on the opposite sides of the board. There are some openings where you have to do this. For example, in the English opening you often are attacking on the queen side, so if black chooses to castle king side you don't really have a checkmating plan for quite a long time. But in the majority of openings in blitz I generally play with a king attack on the king in mind. And here I played g5, attempting to force white backwards, but they don't do it. They do a fork on me. So we have the trade of minor pieces, essentially, and I'm able to take the pawn, going a pawn up, and thought I was comfortable. Might play a move like knight c6, and then castle on the queen side, with my h-file still being used to put pressure on their king side position. But white then made the inexplicable move, bishop takes f4, and I was now a clear piece up. g3, moving a pawn near the king, making their position very dangerous. I check, king g2, knight c6. I don't yet do any sacrifices or big committal moves. I instead finish development. I'll have plenty of time to get some huge attack later, or simply close out the win with simple trading of pieces. So I take the opportunity to win a pawn. Knight b5 is chosen, and I play queen b6. Normally, like books would say, to trade the queens and then maybe castle on the queen side to save the c7 pawn, and I'll have a clear advantage. But I felt like I was the one who had the better prospects with the queens on the board, because their king is so weak that I think my queen will be very useful in winning the game faster. Maybe I could trade the queens with less risk, but I want to win quickly as well, because as it's an arena tournament on live chess, the more games you play, the more points you can gain. And that's what my plan was if I was going to get the most points out of anybody who was in this event. White plays a4, so I castle on the queen side. c3, I'm assuming it's to play knight d4. I kick the knight, force it to d4, and can trade off knights, getting my advantage but closer and closer. And then I had a tactic in mind, the reason I traded the knights. I did queen takes b2, so it was also for this tactic as well. I was fairly certain it worked, because if black had taken with their queen on d4, I may have still done this move, queen takes b2, but I could have traded the queens. So I was keeping my options open. And what's very nice is if the king moves, I checkmate on h2 with the queen. And can you see what I played after rook f2, blocking the check? I play a deflection tactic, or an X-ray attack, with rook takes h2. If the king does not take my rook, I can take their one with my queen next turn, and it will be checkmate. So when they took me, I took on f2, forcing the king to stay on the h-file. Doesn't matter which way they move. rook h8 is now a checkmate. So that was a pretty good game. I'd berserked on that game as well. So at this point I was leading in the tournament. In the next game that I'm going to show, I started playing stronger players who were representing the Finland side. Got a 2100, and this game I chose to play a French. And after knight c3, I should be playing the Vinava a bit more with bishop b4, but in this game and most of my games, I did d takes e4 in response to the classical, and I chose the Fort Knox variation, where you play bishop c6, and then usually you end up playing knight d7 and knight f6, and at some point giving away your bishop on c6 for one of white's knights. So you're giving away the bishop pair, but you're getting a very hard to crack position, and here I play knight f6 first because I can often get white's light squared bishop thrown in as well. So I've given up my bishop pair, but I've got white's as well. And here I like my dark squared bishops. Usually they're at least equal to the white bishop on c1. And with my castle in kingside and white doing the same, I don't really have to worry too much about being mated or losing to some big attack. Knight g5 is a move that threatens mate, but I can easily parry that without making any weakening pawn moves with knight f6. And here this is probably a bit inaccurate playing h6, but I did want to make sure that I wasn't going to throw away the win in some, or throw away the drawing position in some silly way. We trade and queen f6. I've got a very solid structure, so the trade of pieces may help me a little bit more than white, because I have fewer weaknesses to exploit. But white's done very well not to play pawn c4, because if they play pawn c4, their d4 pawn and their c4 pawn to an extent can be targeted by my pieces. With their pawn chain b2 to d4, I have fewer targets to aim at. b3, it's somewhat a diseased pawn chain. It's not nearly as strong as it was when the pawn was on b2. But they want to make their bishop a bit stronger by putting it on the fianchettoed b2 square. And I think their plan involves playing c4 and d5, aiming at my queen and putting their pawns on light squares where my bishop will not be able to catch them. I played rook fe8 to improve the rook, and I was thinking about playing e5. But they play c4, queen f5. This is a bit of an inaccuracy, to be honest, but as I was ahead on time, I thought that with the trade of queens, ironically, even though it takes the game closer to its end in terms of there being fewer pieces on the board, I think it extends the game, to be honest, because queenless rook and pawn endings can last an awfully long time. And with them being behind on the clock, I would be able to put pressure on them via flagging, essentially. Here I play bishop b4, attempting to force the rook off of the e-file, but they find the very accurate rook e5. I have to play g6 to defend the pawn. I don't really want to take with my rook yet. a3, and here I think I do have to trade in order for me not to be horribly under pressure. And if rook d1, I can play rook d8 and try to play on in a bishop ending. But b4 was chosen and bishop c7, f4, and now white definitely has what's called a bad bishop. The bishop on b2 is going to be blocked in a lot by their own pawns, and my bishop will have pawns to aim at, so it's more active of the two. I therefore don't really mind if the rooks are traded. White offers the trade, and I accept it, then bring my king to the centre of the board, or as close to it as I can make. And here maybe I should go b5, but I was thinking about playing g5 to undermine them. The reason b5 might be good is I want the d5 square for my own king. The trouble with b5 though is after king d3, I can't ever force their c4 pawn to move, and if I ever take them, they'll take back with the king, and their king is now very active. So possibly my move is correct, because it's a pawn move which, to be honest, doesn't really achieve much if white plays accurately. This pawn move, though, does undermine their chain from f4 to e5. They played g3 to strengthen it, and then I played g4. So I'm locking up their pawns due to the en passant rule. They can't play h4 because I can take it on h3. So now I always have the tempo gainer h5, or the spare tempo h5. King f2, and I check, trying to force them to play c5 and let me into d5 with the king, but they don't do it. Then I play bishop d8, and we have a trade of h-pawns that achieves nothing. King f2, and their king is a bit off-center, so I now take the time to play f6. And if we have the trade of all the pieces, I suspect it is a draw, but I was hoping I might be able to squeeze something from the position. White does not elect to play that, though. They play king e3, centralizing the king, and we trade the pawns. Bishop check, and again I'm trying to provoke the c5 move, which I do, and drop the bishop back, and I realise that king d4 may still draw the game for white, but I had a little trick that I was thinking about. If white goes king d4, what move do you think I had planned? Okay, I'm going to play it Shirov style. Bishop h4. It doesn't quite work, that was the problem. But I was looking at it, so who knows, I might have played it in a different life. My plan was to push my pawn, but the white king just makes it back in time. So if you said bishop h4, you would be wrong, unfortunately, so well done for not saying it. But it's useful to spot that plan. So my actual trap was to play bishop e7. And this is I think it's subtle, but maybe not. The reason it's subtle is the white king needs to stop me going king d5. And the only square their king can move to, which prevents me going there, is king c4. So if white plays a4, I can play like a6, and nothing's achieved. So I'm hoping that instead of moving their bishop somewhere, like maybe bishop g7 is the strongest move, I'm hoping that they play king c4. And now this nearly works again, but their bishop can go to d4, which I hadn't spotted actually, to be honest. So I don't think this bishop h4 ever works, but it's sort of very close to working. And I would try these little tricks like this, but it may just be a draw. In the game, white played a4, which I think is a big mistake. King d5. Then they played bishop d6, not even stopping me going king c4. Suddenly my king has been centralized. I win a pawn, and all I have to do is make sure they don't get their own king to e5 with a win. I play the check and force their bishop in front. I don't trade it, I put my bishop back, trying to win the c5 pawn, and now they go bishop d6, essentially offering me a draw. My problem is, if I don't play bishop f6, or bishop takes bishop, they'll play king e5. And then it's a race, which I'm not sure I'm winning. But if I play bishop f6, they go bishop back to e5, and maybe they can get a repetition of moves. I then decided to take the bishop because I thought I was just in time with king d7, key move, preventing king e6, and pushing their d-pawn. I lose my f-pawn, but now is the time to push the a-pawn. They took on g4. If they play king e5, trying to get close enough to my pawn, I will be able to take on d6. And it may be drawn. I thought it was winning for me, but it might be a draw. The thing that I have as a sort of trump card is that my king can always stay inside the box. As long as my king is in this area here, I will easily be able to catch their pawn if they ever push it. So my plan was to bring my king up as far as I could, and pushing my pawns as well, either with a3 or with b3. King c4, let's say. And here, what I was hoping for was my king can still go to b4. It's just inside the square. So after king a3, actually king c3 would also probably win, but for the sake of argument, let's say white had played more accurately and let me play king b4. I will be able to go outside the square because I'm much too close for white to ever have a chance in winning the race. So king c3, they will push, and then king c2, push f6, and then I can make a queen, and it's an easy win. So that was my thinking. And yeah, I was pretty certain it was winning anyway. But they played king takes g4, and I kept on pushing the a pawn. And push. And here, the key move is, if I push the a pawn again, they play f7, and then they get a queen as well. King takes d6 was the necessary move. And if they'd pushed f7, king e7 would have stopped them. They try to bring their king up, but now I'm too quick. f7, again I prevent the queen. King g6, and I make the queen, and they're one move too slow. They resigned, so I won the game. And on to the next match. This was one of the strongest players Finland had. I believe it was the number 2 in rating. And in this game, I didn't really play that well. I made a mouse slip on move 1, so I played c3 instead of c4. I made the best of it though and transposed into a London system, which is a bit passive, but it's a very nice way of setting up and just being slightly better than equal. So here Black has played it very well. They haven't taken my bishop yet, which would let me take with the h-pawn, getting an attack on their king side. This f6 plan from Black indicates they want to play e5 later in the game. So I break with e4 first, not giving them the satisfaction of playing their e5 move. And the moment I castle, they do take my bishop. Here I make a practical choice. H takes is the more principled move, capturing towards the centre of the board. But I take with the f-pawn to improve my rook. Knight b6, and I capture to open the e-file and play queen c2, connect the rooks, and activate both rooks. e7 and rook a e1. So I've already made a nice position, and it was around now I was thinking about sacrificing on g6, but I haven't yet had the courage to do it. Also, they're very low on time compared to me. I thought that sacrificing would, in a way, make them play the best moves. So I try to keep the pressure on with knight c5, attacking their queen, putting my knight in their half of the board, but I couldn't see how to proceed. They've got a very solid position right now, and this game mostly petered out really. There was a trade of rooks. I improved my knight because I can't see how to sacrifice or infiltrate. We traded all our rooks, and then we traded the queens. I thought he would take a draw because he's down to less than 30 seconds, but instead he chose, or I assume it's a he, but it could be a she, chose to play on with the bishop pair, and I had to defend it very accurately here. One slight mistake and it's over. This is why the bishop pair is so useful, even in sort of static endings like this. I can't really improve, and they can keep on manoeuvring around. So I'm trying to trade off all the pawns and maintain this kind of fortress position, not allowing their king to infiltrate. So I'm moving back and forth with the bishop, not letting their bishop to d1 or to c4. And then bishop d3, again preventing bishop a6 to c4. King e2. What's nice is my knight on b3 prevents their bishop on h6 from moving into like d2 and c1, targeting my c3 pawn. So I go to and fro with the knight, then played g4 to prevent bishop f5. Again, if the more pawns are traded, the better, in my opinion, because that will limit the winning chances for black. And then moving around with the king, I keep on going side to side with the knight, occasionally making a different move and then coming back again. And he's trying to provoke, or they're trying to provoke me to move a lot of my pawns, which would weaken my position a lot if I push them too far. Again, just going back and forth with the king, then back and forth with the knight, king again. I do a slightly different move, knight f3, to see what it is they're doing and prevent king g5, which could have been a black move. Now the king is not able to do that, I can come back, and then black chose to change the pawn structure with g5. I want to trade off bishops and undouble my g-pawns. They don't want that. And again, we get the toing and froing with the knight and the king. I don't really know how to swap pieces off in terms of like forcing the trade. And my theory is that if I can simply avoid black's bishops infiltrating, I should be fine. My only weaknesses are c3 and h3. The bishop on h5 to me doesn't have a chance of reaching h3, and my king is close enough to c3 that I don't need to worry here. So finally black pushes c5 because there's no other way to break through. We trade, and if I go knight b3, pawn c4 would fork king and knight. I'm not falling for that. Here trading might have been wrong. Maybe I should have gone knight f3, but I simply saw that my knight had the d4 square now. And I can then go to and fro with the king. And again, shuffle the king around, put my bishop on d3. Now the bishop and the pawn on c3 prevent their king getting to the 4th rank. They put me in check. I put them in check. And, black has slightly improved. Their king has reached the centre of the board. But it's not easy for black to make progress from here, because even if they win a pawn, if it's opposite coloured bishops, they're getting nowhere. And here I played knight e2, forcing off the bishop for knight because of the fork on c1 and f4. Bishop to d2, I push the pawn, we trade, and then we take a draw, as it's practically impossible to win from here. As they played extremely well and put me under a lot of pressure with only like 30 seconds with the increment being added the whole game. And I didn't use up loads of time, but I had to play it relatively accurately. So that was a good game, I thought. Right, we're near the end of the tournament. I had quite a few points, but I was behind a very, very strong Finnish player who was over 2400 and who I had I think I had drawn to earlier in the tournament, and also the English Grandmaster John Nunn had joined, and he is a very, very strong rapid play player. I had the pleasure to play him once over the board in a tournament, and he did win that game. He probably would beat me quite a few times if we played each other. So he was ahead of me on points, but not by much, only by like one or two games. So I still had hope that I would overtake both the Finnish player and John Nunn to essentially come first in what was a team tournament. Perhaps my ego was getting the better of me. And here I've played a kind of Tarrasch type setup with this knight on c3 and f6, c6 and f6, and pawns on c5 and d5. But white has set up their own queen to pawn move, and I just completely blundered here with c takes d4. Fortunately for me, my opponent did not take my knight, which was on offer. They played knight takes d4. So with great relief, I took on d5. Then they allowed me to capture back and strengthen my pawn on d5 with another pawn on c6. So I've escaped once from a very bad position very early in the game. And here we both castle on the king's side and improve our pieces. I played bishop g4, again getting out the light squared bishop early on to attempt to improve all my minor pieces. And I'm happy trading off bishops as it gets rid of my worst minor piece generally. And again, I take with the f-pawn because even though the h-pawn is better, as it's a blitz tournament and a blitz game, I think my chances are maximised by improving the pieces. So my f-rook is now on an open file. Queen c7 attacks their knight, but they defend. Again, rook to e8, attacking their unguarded pawn, and they defend it. Knight h5, and they play the right move, pawn f4, again blunting the attack on their g3 knight. I come back, they come forwards, and I jump into the square that's now available to me as I've provoked the move pawn f4. White trades, and I bring in my rook, so I'm blockading their e3 pawn, which could be a weakness coming up. I continue to attack the pawn, they defend it, I attack, they defend. And here I thought I found a nice move. Rook takes f4. Can you see what happens if they play pawn takes rook? What happens is, if they take, I will take on e1. Their bishop's pinned. So I have to play rook takes rook. I'll take back. It's almost mate, but their queen has the blocking square. But then I have the very nice bishop takes f2. Their only legal move is to move the king to the corner, and then I checkmate. That was the plan. But after I take the pawn, they don't fall for it and play rook c1. I drop the bishop back to keep it guarded and anchored to b6. White captures the pawn, and I then didn't realise that my pawn on d5 was also being attacked. And that's why I played rook f6 to trade rooks, hoping I could undouble my pawns. Queen takes d5, and I'm now in real trouble. I was almost forced to play rook e6, pinning myself. I'm close to lost, but I do wriggle out by trading off rooks. Check, and queen f6, attempting to, again, undouble pawns. White lets me off the hook and does acquiesce to this plan. My only sort of hope is that my rook and bishop combo can overpower White's rook and bishop combo by virtue of the fact that they have the weak e3 pawn, and I hope they'll get tied down to defending it. I play rook c6, trying to infiltrate on the second and first rank, but White does play the right move, offering the trade. I don't want to trade. Check, and then play rook c5, which is another mistake I've made in this match. It was a very poor game. They have the essentially winning move, bishop d6, forking the king and rook. But they don't spot it, and I'm down to 20 seconds as I'd berserked this game, and they had not. They played rook d2. I saw I'd seen the threat now, so I put them in check. Played king f7, and they played rook d7 check, king e6, rook d6, king e7, rook back to d3, keeping their pieces all guarded. So now I was getting very panicky in terms of my play, because I'm down to 17 seconds with no increment, and they have over 2 minutes. This is not looking too good for me at all. I have to be very aggressive and hope for the best. So I'm moving up pawns. They attack me. I keep on trying to create something with the rook, but I can't. And in the end, I choose to trade, hoping that their isolated pawns, making their pawn structure not as good as mine, might be able to help me. And they play e4 check, which is maybe not the best move, but it makes a lot of sense to force me back. Then they move the bishop. I played g4, and I had a small hope, which is starting to grow, because bishop g1 does attack the h2 pawn, no way to guard it. Then bishop takes h2. They're running their king to the a pawn. I have to keep playing aggressively with pawn h4, and now this is probably winning if I had enough time. They choose to take me though, so that speeds up the process, I think. Bishop takes bishop, and my pawn is way too fast for them to have a chance of promoting, but I'm down to 8 seconds. So quickly cut the king off on the a file, bring my bishop in, and here a5 is the most stubborn defense, upon which I was going to have to bring my king to c6. But instead they played king a7, and with just a few seconds on my clock, I did a checkmate. So this was a very nice win, and it led us to the last game of the event. And the way this event runs, the way arena tournaments work, is that there's a time limit for when the tournament has ended, and if you're still playing a game at that point, that game doesn't count towards your tournament score. So at this stage I was, I believe, 1 point ahead of John Nunn, and I think I was also a point ahead of the Finnish top player, and both of them were playing each other. John Nunn was playing this top Finnish player, and I just started this game here with about 2 minutes left of the tournament clock left to go. John Nunn was doing very well against the Finnish player by the time I'd started this, and I was hoping that he would not have enough time to finish his game, so I would stay in the lead. I was playing at 2200 though, so I didn't have a lot of chances to win this game. But I gave it a try with the Sicilian Smith-Morra gambit. They do not choose to accept it, and I chose to play a strange move, taking on d4. And I'm losing my e4 pawn, but I'm hoping I can gain initiative, and as there isn't much time left at the tournament, I need to do anything I can to confuse the issue. So here they don't accept the gambit, possibly because they just didn't see it. I play this quick d5 and trade knights to get my pawn on d5 to become potentially a passed pawn. Put in the check and trade pieces, attempting to get it into a position that I can kind of understand. Play bishop g5. They play bishop d4 to centralize the bishop. I capture their knight in order to make their pawn structure worse, weaken their king's position, and hopefully get the win. They choose correctly though. I was hoping they'd take with the queen, so I had knight d5. But here I don't have knight d5 at all. I have the check instead. Again, I trade queens, which I think is a poor decision, to be honest, if I'm trying to win quickly. I should be keeping the queens on to maximize chances of checkmating early on. And we trade off everything, going into a rook and pawn ending, which is not indicative of a way to win quickly. I play e5, trying to stop black playing e5, giving them a protected pawn on d4, which would be a thorn in my side. They improve the rooks, and then I play f5, which is a sort of desperate attempt to confuse them and go for their king. They take, I play rook e1. Then they take me, which may not be correct. I think they should have moved one of their rooks. But this allows me to win back the pawn on e5 for nothing with initiative. Then keep checking and keep checking, down to 42 seconds. I trade rooks and then attack their pawn. Possibly rook c4 is the best move, but I think I could then play g4 or king f2 or b3. They instead play rook c2, cutting off my king from going up the board. That's why rooks on the 2nd and 7th rank are so good, usually. And also attacking a lot of my pawns. I let them go, and then temporarily save the a-pawn in order for me to win the h-pawn, and it's a race. b6, I then play g4, and the idea is if they take my pawn now with the king, I can play g5, discover check, and then take their h7 pawn. And my pawn on the g file is closer than their a and b pawns to the promotion square. So this is exactly what happens. then rook b4. They're attempting to play rook g4 check, winning my pawn. And in these rook and pawn endings, if you put your rook behind the passed pawn, with either side, that's the ideal position for your rooks in relation to the pawn. So I want my rook on g2, g3, or g4, and so does black. If they had put me in check, I could have blocked it with rook g3. So now I push, then play rook g3 behind the passed pawn. They put their rook in front of it, so I've dominated their rook. Now they're the one down to only a few seconds, and I have about a 10-second cushion on them. Both pushing our pawns, but as you can see, mine are much quicker than theirs. I attack the rook, force it away, then keep pushing my pawns. Black valiantly tries to catch up, but they are too slow. Then they put me in check, I block. There are now no more good checks that keep the rooks on, so they trade. And I have less time than them now, because I berserked and they didn't, so they're getting the increment and I'm not. So I make the queen. They push their pawn. I realise I have to keep checking, and I must have missed loads of mates in 2 or mates in 1. I play another check, again trying to box them in with 6 seconds on my clock. They block the check. I attempt to go queen takes b5 mate next turn, but they move the king. Here I have queen a8 checkmate in 1, but I don't see it. I play queen takes b5, king to a7, and then with just a second left on my clock, I do checkmate them. And the bad news was that I checkmated them about 10 seconds after the tournament had finished. This game did not count. John Nunn had won his game, and there was also another English player who had won, I think, 2 games in the space of about 3 minutes, who had caught up to the leaders. So the final standings were that John Nunn got the most points, I believe, with 36 out of out of all his wins. I think he won every game. Very impressive score, and he also arrived late to the tournament, so even more impressive. Then the Finnish player was on 32 in 4th place, I suppose, and I was on 33, but I think I would have got 37 if I we got 38, I think, if I'd have won this game with like 10 seconds to spare. But I had 33, and there was another player who was also on 33, who was an English player. England won the team event though with a score of, I believe, 500 points was the combination of the top 20 players, and Finland had about 300 because even though they had a very, very strong top 2 players, 2400 plus, they didn't seem to have a good depth to their team. So they had a few 2100s and the odd 2200, but then a lot of players in the 2000s. But the England team had more players, and a lot of them were about 2200 or higher. So we were able to win the match. And I thought these games were somewhat interesting. Hopefully you found them entertaining, and see you next time. Bye.